Barb Nation! We've heard all season long barbarians are dead, the worst class out there. I'm here to tell you that just isn't the case. Sure, it takes some work to get the builds up and running, but the damage output is pretty insane when you do. You're seeing it pop up everywhere right now. Tier 8 bosses in under 30 seconds, with no invigorating buff. Barbs have found a way. I'm going to highlight a build that Viet's put together. Check him out on YouTube. We finished working on it this morning, and I'm so excited to bring it to you. Check out this boss fight here, and then we'll hop into the build. As we were putting this build together, we got this link sent to us. This is almost the same build. Different Paragon board, but the setup is pretty similar. They're going to be running all of the Ancients instead of the Wrath of the Berserker, but both will work for you. There's no invigorating buff here. We're just going to be using an elixir. The damage is absolutely insane for this build. So you see the timer running. This is going to be sub 30 seconds. Once we get towards the end, I'm going to show you what some of the damage numbers look like too. Ground Stomp is reducing the cooldown of your Call of the Ancients, which will do the same thing if you're running Wrath of the Berserker here. With Wrath of the Berserker, you're actually going to see a little bit more damage out of this, but Call of the Ancients has the option to come up sooner sometimes. If you take a look, we're at 25 seconds in. Here's 218 million, 236 million. The damage, 237 million. It is through the roof. So anybody that says Whirlwind cannot do damage, take a look at this. This is happening so quickly. As you can see, just like all of the builds this season, numbers are everywhere. Unless you pause it and break it down, it is not easy to see. Finish of the fight, see the timer just below 30 seconds. And that's it. So fast. That timer was just below. We're looking at just sub 30 seconds for this fight. No invigorating buff. If you put the time in, this build is going to sink. Make sure you go check out FIFA on YouTube. That is the person that we took this clip from. They just posted it the other day. Whirlwind is making a comeback this season. Let's hop into the build. Before we break down the build, this is an endgame build. This is designed specifically for running the Infernal Hordes, not for pushing the pits. This requires a lot of really good gear with really good masterworking rolls. We're going to start with your skill tree. We're going to be going into Lunging Strike so that we can unlock Whirlwind. We're going to go all the way down through Furious Whirlwind to give ourselves a little bit of bleed. We're going to do 2 points into Pressure Point. This is going to give our core skills, which is Whirlwind, a 20% chance to grant vulnerable damage to enemies. We're going to go 1 point into Ground Stomp. This build is going to utilize Ground Stomp for some additional damage, and we'll get into that more when we get to the aspects and the Paragon board. We're going to go all the way through Enhance Ground Stomp into Strategic Ground Stomp. Reduce the cooldowns of your ultimate skill by 2 seconds for each enemy hit by Ground Stomp. Ground Stomp is going to hit a lot of enemies, especially in the Infernal Horde, so we're going to be reducing the cooldown of our ultimate very quickly. We're going to do 3 points into Imposing Presence for some more max life. We're going to do 3 points into Martial Vigor for some damage reduction from elites. We're going to do 1 point into Rallying Cry, and we're going to go all the way down through Strategic Rallying Cry. This is going to give us our Fortify, will also give us a source of Unstoppable and a little bit of movement speed. We're also going to go into Challenging Shout. We're going to go all the way down through Enhanced Challenging Shout. This will give us 20% maximum life as long as it's up. We're going to go 4 points into Warcry. We're going to go all the way down through Power Warcry. This is going to grant us an additional 10% bonus whenever there are 6 enemies or more around, which in the Infernal Hordes, if you've done it before, there's always that many around. It's going to add that 10% to our Warcry. We're going to be stacking as much as we can into Warcry so we can get the maximum bonus out of it. We're going to do 3 points into Booming Voice to increase the duration of our shouts. We're going to do 3 points into Raid Leader. This will give us a passive heal. While our shouts are active, we're going to be healing 3% of our maximum life. You do not need to spam all of your shouts at one time. If you want to keep Raid Leader running, make sure that you're using all of your shouts in increments and not just at one time. We're going to do 2 points into Guttural Yell. This is going to give us 8% damage reduction from enemies that are around us. We're going to do 3 points into aggressive resistance while we're berserking, and we're going to have berserk up all the time. We're going to take 12% reduced damage while berserking. We're going to do 3 points into Pit Fighter. We're going to deal 9% increased damage to close enemies, then gain 6% damage reduction. We're going to do 3 points into Slaying Strikes. This is really going to come into play when you're fighting maybe a Desecrator or when you're fighting the bosses. You're going to deal 24% increased damage, that's a multiplier, against injured enemies. Injured state is below 35%. Most of your normal monsters with this build are going to die way before this even kicks in. So you're really only going to see this when you're fighting monsters with a lot of life like the bosses. If you're going to go down into Thick Skin for 1 point, and 3 points into Counteroffensive, whenever our Fortify is over 50%, we're going to get 12% increased damage. We're going to do 3 points into Wallop. So in order to get Wallop to work, we're going to be using a one-handed mace and a one-handed sword. This is going to give us that 15% increased multiplier to enemies that are vulnerable because we're going to be using a bludgeoning weapon. This is going to be a dual wield build. We're going to be running a Rambalades and a one-handed mace. Because we're going to be running a Rambalades, we're going to stack as much fury as we possibly can. You're going to go 3 points into Tempered Fury. This is going to give you 9 additional maximum fury. We're going to take Wrath of the Berserker for this build, and we're going to go all the way down through Supreme Wrath of the Berserker. And then for your key passive, we're going to take Unconstrained. For your Paragon board, in the starter board, we're going to be running Exploit. This is going to give us 3 seconds of vulnerable damage every 20 seconds as soon as we damage an enemy. With Whirlwind, because a lot of the damage is going out right away, is going to be very strong. As soon as they hit them, they get that 20% multiplier from enemies being vulnerable. We're going to do more damage to them. Coming up, we're going to go into the Decimator board. Each time you make an enemy vulnerable, you're going to increase the damage by 10% for 5 seconds. Whirlwind does not overpower, so you won't see that additional 10%. In this board, we're going to be running Ambidextrous. We're running this because you deal 8% increased damage while wielding a one-handed weapon, and that's what we're going to be using. Coming over, we're going to be going into the Carnage board. We're going to take Twister in here. We're going to put a lot of points into this to try and stack the amount of additive damage that's going into your Dust Devils, because the Dust Devils is where the damage is. You're going to get 13% increased damage for 4 seconds after creating a Dust Devil. This will always be up because we're always creating Dust Devils. That extra multiplier is going to help a lot. Coming down, we're going to go into the Warbringer board. Inside of this board, we're going to be running Wrath. We're going to put a lot of points into this because we're going to be stacking critical strike damage. The reason we're stacking critical strike damage is because we're going to be running the Grandfather. There's been a lot of testing, and a lot of the times the critical strike damage that we're going to gain, because it's doubled, is giving us a lot more damage than most of the other stats are going to be doing. Moving over, we're going to be going into the Blood Rage board. Killing a bleeding enemy with a 10% chance of Grand Berserking for 5 seconds. That is going to be beneficial, but most of the time, Berserking will be up all the time, so we don't really need to worry about that too much. Your damage is increased by 10% of your damage while Berserking bonus, up to a maximum of 30% multiplicative. What's going to be different about this? We are actually going to be under cap with this build. The reason is, if we take the critical strike damage tempers over the damage while berserking tempers, we actually end up with more damage than we would if we put a maximum into this legendary node. So for this one particular build, you may end up just under. That's the goal of this build. In this board, we're going to be running Marshal. After casting a shout skill, the active cooldowns of every other non-shout skill is reduced by 2 seconds. And for the final board here, we're going to be going into the Flawless Technique board. Inside of that board, we're going to be running Rumble. This is where Ground Stomp is going to come into play. You deal 10% increased damage to bosses and crowd-controlled enemies for each active Earthquake. And we'll talk about how we're going to get Earthquakes when we get into the gear. For the gear. For the helmet, you're going to be running the Harlequin's Crest. We're going to put our Masterworking crits into cooldown reduction. Like I said, this is an endgame build. This is going to require a lot of triple Masterworking. In order to get this running, where you can clear those tier 8s very quickly, you are going to need very, very good gear. So this will take a little while to get up and running. So whenever you can, start working towards those triple Masterworking. For the chest piece, we're going to be running Tyrael's Might. I put 2 masterworking crits into damage reduction and 1 into elemental resistances all. So this is the cap, not the resistance itself. For the gloves, we're going to be running Earthquake Aspect. This is where you're going to get your earthquakes from with Ground Stomp. Ground Stomp creates an earthquake, damaging enemies. While standing in the earthquake, you deal up to 25% increased damage. So now, with your Rumble Glyph, you're getting 10% increased multiplicative. And then also, while you're inside of that earthquake, you're going to be getting 25% increased multiplicative damage. So this is actually going to be a very big boost to your damage here. For the affixes, this is a glass cannon build. It's going to take a little while to get used to the gameplay style, but we're not going to be running really much max life at all. It's all going to come from the Paragon board and then any of the uniques that have max life on it. For the affixes, we're going to be running critical strike chance, strength, critical strike damage. Your tempers are going to be critical strike damage, which we're going to put 3 masterworking crits into, and then earthquake duration. This is going to allow your earthquakes to last longer. We can stack them up. For your pants, we're going to be running Tumult's Will. For this one, we're going to make sure that we put all of the masterworking crits into your maximum resources. Anytime we become unstoppable, which is going to be using Rallying Cry, we deal 20% increased damage. For the boots, we're going to be running the Ghostwalker aspect. Anytime that we become unstoppable, we're going to gain 25% movement speed. If your movement speed is great and you're finding that you don't need it all, we can also run something like Concussive Strikes. This will give us just a little bit more damage when enemies are dazed. But for now, we're going to keep on Ghostwalker. For your tempers, we're going to be running Strength, Movement Speed, and then Ranks to Warcry. We're going to put 3 masterworking crits into Warcry. For your tempers, we're going to be running Movement Speed and then Earthquake Duration to keep that Earthquake up as long as possible. For the two-handed mace, we're going to be running Dust Devil Aspect. Every time that you cast Whirlwind, you're going to cast a Dust Devil. This is the reason that we tap Whirlwind. When you're running through normal monsters, if you need to, you can just channel Whirlwind. We should have enough damage to get through it. But when you get to monsters that have a lot of life, you're going to want to make sure that you're tapping the Whirlwind button to cast Dust Devils as much as possible. This is your strongest Dust Devil right here. For the affixes, we're going to be running Strength, Max Life, Critical Strike Damage. And then this is going to be the only place that we're going to temper damage while berserking. You're going to put on your two-handed mace to get the most out of it that you can. And then we're going to put Dust Devils cast twice. We're going to put 3 masterworking crits into that. For the dual wield weapon, we're going to be running Aspects of Fierce Winds. Your shouts create 3 Dust Devils. Every time that we shout, we're going to get 3 Dust Devils. The bottom part of this is your Dust Devils are 20% bigger and deal 1% increased damage for each 1% of their size. We're going to be running Strength, Max Life, and Critical Strike damage for your affixes. And then for your tempers, we're going to be running Critical Strike damage and Dust Devil size. This is going to convert with our aspect here into a multiplicative damage number for those Dust Devils. For the other dual wield weapon, we're going to be running Ramaladni's Magnum Opus. This is going to be where a huge source of your damage comes from. With this build, you can start pushing upwards of 350 Fury. If you're running 350 Fury, that is a 170% multiplier with a perfect aspect on this weapon. This weapon, you want to make sure you focus on the aspect first before any other greater affixes. If you roll a 40%, but you have a greater affix, that will not be as good as a 50% with no greater affix. So make sure that you worry about the aspect part where your skills using this weapon deal 0.5% increased damage per second per Fury. For the masterworking crits, you want to go into maximum resource because we're going to be stacking as much as we can to make sure that this weapon deals the most damage that it can. While we're using this, and I did some testing myself, this does affect your Whirlwinds. It does say skills using this weapon, but because we're using Whirlwind as a dual wield weapon, it does affect the Dust Devils by quite a bit. I took it off. My Dust Devils did not hit very hard whatsoever. You put it back on, and the difference is amazing. So make sure that your Whirlwind is set to dual wield. For the slashing weapon, we're going to be running the Grandfather. For this, we're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to put your 3 masterworking crits into maximum resource. For the ring, we're going to be running Bold Chieftain. Whenever you cast a shout skill, its cooldown is reduced by 2 seconds per nearby enemy, up to 6 seconds. This will work when you first get to your bosses as well. So when you get to those 3 bosses, as long as there's 3 enemies nearby, which there should be, whenever you shout, you're going to be reducing your cooldown by 6 seconds. It's going to be great to have the shouts up at the very beginning of those fights. For the affixes, we're going to be running critical strike chance, strength, and then chance to make enemies vulnerable. For your tempers, we're going to be running critical strike damage, then war cry cooldown reduction. Put your 3 masterworking crits into critical strike damage. For the other ring, we're going to be running the Ring of Starless Sky. This helps a ton with resource management. Spending your primary resource reduces the cost of your skills and increases your damage by 10% or up to 50%. So now your resources, Whirlwind costs half as much, and you get a 1.5 multiplier from the ring itself. You're going to put your 3 masterworking crits into attack speed. And then for the amulet, we're going to be running Lochran's Talisman. You gain a ton of critical strike damage from this. There's some interaction with it with Whirlwind that is actually giving you a big buff to your damage. So this is actually going to be the new tech that people have been using and they started pulling out. Before, we were using just a regular aspect here and a regular amulet, but this is actually giving a very big boost. We also have maximum resource that we can put in masterworking crits too. So make sure that you put all 3 into that. For your weapon expertise, you're going to be running the 2-handed axe. How the expertise works is that you do not need to be running that weapon in order to get the bonus from the expertise. We're still going to be able to get 10% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, even if you're running a grandfather as the weapon. For your weapon selections for Whirlwind, you're going to make sure that you set this to your dual wield weapons. If we don't, we're going to lose a lot of damage. So this build is built around dual wield Whirlwind. For your gems, we're going to be running emeralds for the critical strike damage in your weapons. And then for your armor, we're actually going to be running strength. This is going to increase your skill damage. If you are dying, it is okay to put rubies in here. This build is built around very good gear that is at a good place with someone that has been playing this build a lot. So it is a glass cannon build. We took all of the damage that we possibly could over a lot of the survivability. So feel it out, see how your character feels, and then you can make a couple changes there if you need to. That's the build. For those of you that are interested in pushing the pits, I'm going to be coming out with another video with a slightly different setup. One little note for this. There is a build out there that uses the Fists of Fate. I'm going to be coming out with a build guide for that specifically. When you zone into a dungeon using the Fists of Fate, it disables the Ramaladni's aspect. You can unequip and re-equip that weapon, but make this easier on everybody so you don't have to constantly unequip and re-equip weapons. We went with the Earthstriker aspect plus the Rumble Glyph. When you get this other build, remember, you have to take out the Ramaladni's and put it back on in order to get it to work. So if you see a build out there where you have hopped into it and you're using Fists of Fate, you're going to lose a lot of damage if you don't do that. It will not work in the pits because you can't change gear. So this build right here is a great option for you. And that's it. That's the build. It is really hard hitting. It is a ton of fun to play. It does a lot of damage despite what everybody's saying. Barbarians are still there. I'm live on YouTube and Twitch pretty much every night. Stop by Theorycraft with me. We're doing Death Blow next. Catch you on the flip side.